My name is Brenda Block-Young. I do the programming for economics and finance at Ollie here at George Mason. Today is really very special. We have with us Dan Klein, Professor Dan Klein from George Mason University. And he is one of the professors in the economics department who has presented every year that I've been a member since 2014. He's a terrific supporter of Ollie. And he also happens to be the Smithian chair. He is our resident expert on Adam Smith. Dan went to George Mason University, New York University. He teaches a lot of classes that are focused on economic principles and public policy issues. And when it came to my attention that this is the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, I reached out to Dan and asked him to do a special session on why Adam Smith is misunderstood. Please join me in thanking Dan.
Hey, thanks a lot. Great to be with you. Great to see everybody in person. It's been a couple years since we've got to meet in person. Yeah, so I'm delighted to do this. It's been a nice year. He was born in 1723, and now we're 2023, so it's the tercentenary. I didn't know that word before this year, but I've been using it a lot this year, the tercentenary. Yeah, so why is Adam Smith misunderstood? That's a really interesting question. There are different interpretations of Smith, and I tend to have certain interpretations. And
his microphone needs to be adjusted.
How so?
I think it is saying that they can't hear.
I'm sorry?
Just
we're working on the microphone. Thanks for the alert, somebody. I'm not sure what's wrong.
No, it's on. The volume's just a little low.
Okay. How's this? Is it better?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Yeah, so I have interpretations, and I can assure you that some people will tell you Klein misunderstands Adam Smith. So that also probably, to some extent, say that my understanding of why Smith is misunderstood is a misunderstanding. So you're just getting me and my interpretations of this bigger question. But I do think that many of us who converse over Adam Smith, and it is a fruitful, diverse conversation, would agree about certain things that I can say. And we'll get to what are the biggest controversies, and in particular about how to think of him ideologically, politically. Who gets to claim Adam Smith? And my position is that I do. Now, who am I? I'm one of those classical liberal George Mason University economists. I believe that government is kind of here and inevitable, and we try to make it less damaging than it might otherwise be, and that generally speaking, the governmentalizing social affairs, intervening by the government, big government players in social affairs, generally doesn't work so well and doesn't correct itself. Whereas voluntary activities, private activities which depend on voluntary participation, including funding, tend to correct. Because if they're doing stuff that people are dissatisfied with, they stop participating. They don't buy the product. They don't support your charity. They decide not to work at your company because you don't treat them well, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Adam Smith's very much of that opinion. I tend to think, therefore, that he's against big government. He's generally in favor of free enterprise. So you could associate him with classical liberalism, maybe certain kinds of conservatism. I do think he's a conservative in certain definite respects. He doesn't want to change things too radically or dramatically. On the other hand, other people want to claim him for the progressives, okay, for the left, which might seem a little odd, but it's interesting, and I'm happy that they want to. I'm happy that they want to claim Adam Smith. You know, many of these Smithian scholars are people I know and have interacted with, sometimes in debates and so forth. And you know, it's nice to bounce this back and forth. I'm happy that they want to claim him as opposed to just wanting to dump him. Like there's other people, they're more or less that I like a lot. They're happy to dump. For example, Milton Friedman. For example, Friedrich Hayek. And so there's like, oh, we can see what he is, and he's bad. So I'm glad that they think that Adam Smith isn't bad. So that's good that we're having this conversation, and I hope they continue to think that Adam Smith isn't bad. I'm a little afraid that if I persuade them of the proper understanding, they're gonna put him into the bad category. So that's kind of a problem. But before I got to a little bit about that kind of conversation, just to give you some sense of what that conversation's like, I want to just treat a little more broadly the remarkable position that Smith is in. How many people do you know like that? I mean, how many big figures or thinkers do diverse people want to claim? Not many, actually. Mostly it's like, oh, those are their good guys and those are their good guys, and there's no intersection or very little intersection. But Smith is in the intersection. And in fact, he's in the intersection of a lot of different interests, a lot of different disciplines, different political point of views, different religious beliefs. Some people who are religious claim him and look up to him. Some people who are not figure that he is not. Okay, so even that is mysterious about Adam Smith. How much of a theist he was, or how much of a Christian he was. And that's one I don't have a very strong opinion about, actually. I don't think it matters so much to my interpretations. But it's remarkable how Sphinx-like Adam Smith could be. He's a Sphinx, and he was very private. He didn't write a lot of letters, and he certainly burned all of his letters and almost all of his papers at the end of his life. David Hume, his best friend, often wrote in his letters complaining about how few letters he was getting back from Adam Smith. Like, why haven't I heard from you? And come on, write to me. Tell me how it's going. You must tell me your opinion of this, that, and the other. Hume also had this great letter where he said, you were just in Edinburgh, so I don't know if you know, but Edinburgh's here and Kirkcaldy is just a bit up north here on the coast. And then there's this island, little island out here. And Hume said, let's meet at that island and discuss everything until we agree and not leave the island. So it was cute. So it was very, fun relationship between those two. But what I want to do is share a couple of things before I say a little bit more about the politics and about maybe one other issue. I want to give you some examples of this Sphinx-like nature and this kind of curious, subtle, sly nature in his writing. He made himself agreeable to many people, relatable, lovable. So you have all these different people who love him. He's a very remarkable figure. And he enabled people to find different things and highlight different things. It's a little bit like the Bible, basically. You know how different people interpret the Bible differently. Maybe you'll have somebody, why do people misunderstand the Bible? And it's like that. He wrote in these esoteric or sly and subtle ways. And this slyness sometimes it takes different forms. And this was a much more common form of writing in his day. It disappeared shortly after his death, this type of writing. Sometimes he creates tensions, apparent contradictions, and sometimes apparent errors or errors. Sometimes just subtleties that maybe only some of the readers will get. But I want to share a couple. Let me begin with this one little passage where he deals with this criticism that he got. This is the moral sentiments. And a lot of people said, okay, Adam Smith, you say that our moral sense involves sympathy and that we look for sympathy or shared sentiment to figure out what's morally right, okay? Now, a lot of people said, that's very unsatisfactory. What you're saying is that if the community has a dominant sentiment, then that, sympathizing with that is your source of sympathy, is your avenue to sympathy, but that might be wrong. The community might be wrong. A lot of people therefore accused him of a sort of conformist theory of moral judgment, of moral approval, like whatever the community says is right is morally right, a kind of relativism, because communities differ and can be wrong. Well, he certainly understood that. And in the 6th edition, he expounded further on why he's not that. His proper view is your moral judgment cannot make itself independent of all social influences, but it can make itself independent of any one social influence, including a dominant community influence. So you develop judgment that can be independent of any particular influence, even the dominant community influence. He definitely taught us that. So it's social because you're still going to draw on some kind of social and sympathetic resources, but it might be just a few people that you're in sympathy with. And even people who aren't near you, who aren't around the neighborhood, even people who are no longer alive. So he was talking about this here, and he says, the wise man rests content and secure upon the genuine truth and solidity of his own character. His admirers may neither be very numerous nor very loud in their applause. But the wisest man, who sees him the nearest and knows him the best, admires him the most. To a real wise man, the judicious and well-weighed approbation of a single wise man gives more heartfelt satisfaction than all the noisy applauses of 10,000 ignorant and enthusiastic admirers. And then he gives this example. He may say with Parmenides, who, upon reading a philosophical discourse before a public assembly at Athens, and observing that except Plato, the whole company had left him, continued, notwithstanding, to read on, and said that Plato alone was audience sufficient for him. So what he's saying is just Plato, he just ended up talking to Plato. He lectured to Plato. And he said, that's plenty, that's fine, If I've got Plato's attention and Plato's approval, I'm on the right, I feel I'm on the right track. Now, he said that Parmenides gave this address. Parmenides is not actually the character in the story that Cicero tells. It's Antimachus, okay? It's a different guy. And furthermore, so he switched Antimachus with Parmenides. Was this just a mistake? Was this a slip up? No, it was not a slip up. He in fact knows very well that Parmenides would have, if Plato was 20, in the audience, Parmenides would have been something like 106. So Parmenides was long gone. In fact, there's one dialogue by Plato. It's called, the title is Parmenides. And in that dialogue, it's a very unique dialogue because the main speaker is not Socrates. Socrates is a neophyte. He's the 20-year-old listening to Plato, who dominates the thing. And Smith knew his Plato, I assured you. So, and he in fact referred in another work, Smith did, to Parmenides as an anti-Socratic, that is to say, before Socrates, Greek philosopher. This was deliberate. Swapping in Parmenides for Antimachus was deliberate. Why would he do that? Well, it heightens the point he's making. Think about it. If it's Parmenides and he's writing for Plato, Plato's not even born yet. That's how remote your wise audience might have to be. That's how independent you might have to be. He's heightening his point that you're speaking not just to some smartest guy in the room, Plato, who you happen to be contemporaries with, but no, if there's no one in this generation that gets it, I'll talk to the next one. That's what I think is happening here. So I'm just showing you, this is the kind of thing he does. This is the kind of thing he does. So, you know, yeah. Let me give you another example. Well, it involves the famous parable of the poor man's son. You see, he tells this story. It's kind of like a parable. We call it the parable of the poor man's son. And the poor man's son, whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition, when he begins to look around him, admires the condition of the rich. Now he's poor, his dad is poor, and so he becomes ambitious and he works his way up. And apparently he works his way up through hard work and service, and he becomes rich in this parable. I'm not going to read it. And then at the end of his life, the now rich poor man's son, he says, what did I do with my life? I'm miserable. I worked hard. I squandered away all those opportunities to enjoy the world, to go out, to travel, to fall in love or whatever. And I worked hard and kept my nose to the grindstone, and I focused so much. And now I've got this big estate. I've got these big businesses and operations to take care of. They're constantly ready to explode and crush me in their unfortunate ruins. This is some of his language. And he's like, what did I do? And Smith gives the impression that actually this guy made a mistake developing his human capital, selling it to the market, and contributing to the economy, which is a weird thing to think about because we think of Smith as a prophet of free enterprise. He's saying, no, don't you waste your life trying to get rich. That doesn't sound like a regular advocate of free enterprise, right? So then he says, well, then there's another humor or point of view that we sometimes have, and there we kind of admire all this activity. And furthermore, he goes on, it creates all of these benefits by being industrious, by working hard, by selling your services to the market. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths. In other words, this kind of ambition and striving to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life, which have entirely changed the face of the globe, have turned the rude forests of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, and so on. And so what he's doing is he's saying, he speaks of what motivated the poor man's son as a deception. He says, it is this deception which rouses and keep in continual motion. So he's saying the poor man's son was deceived. It's good that he was deceived. But where does that leave the poor man's son? Now, what I think is going on here just again, to understand the subtlety. And Smith, believe me, does not spell what I'm about to say out. So it's something that as a reader, you have to read into the whole thing. Smith is telling the story of the poor man's son so that readers who are young readers, can read about the regret of the old poor man's son, the now rich poor man's son. They can also read about how, well, the industrious poor man's son actually helped the world, and it's in a way good for humankind that he did. So where does that leave you now as this young reader? Well, now maybe you'll go forward and take part in the world and be ambitious, but with a different attitude about, hey, look, I'm not really expecting this to make me happy. To some extent, I'm doing it because I understand it's good for society and it's helping people. You know, I'm selling my services and marginal productivity, if you remember microeconomics, moving out the budget constraints, right, for people. And that's all good. So it creates, so what's happening here is he's creating almost an invisible parable of the reader of this story and this lesson. And so then when he comes, just to, so that's another kind of paradox. But this continues where he starts to talk about a proud landlord, rich landlord, who might be the same poor man's son. And he says at the end of this paragraph, which is where he mentions the invisible hand, he mentions it one time in this book, and he says this: in ease of body and peace of mind, all the different ranks of life are nearly upon a level. And the beggar who suns himself by the side of the highway possesses that security which kings are fighting for. Okay, let me read that last part. The beggar who suns himself by the side of the highway possesses that security which kings are fighting for. Now that sounds pretty far-fetched, like beggars and kings have it just as good and are just as, have the same security in some psychic way. But again, there's a subtle reference here. Does anyone by any chance know what Smith is alluding to when he says this? I'm just want to check, give a chance. I don't suppose so, but.
Is it because the poor man isn't constantly aware or nervous of other people pushing him out of his position?
That what? Yeah.
So basically a king is constantly
Yeah.
working to keep people.
Yeah.
That the king is basically
that's-
always positioning himself, whereas the beggar.
That's what he means.
might not.
That's what he means about this. But there's actually a specific, again, classical allusion that he's doing here, and his more learned readers would know it. He's not actually saying any beggar, all beggars have it just as good as the rich people. This is a reference about a certain beggar, a certain quite famous beggar in ancient Greece, who was actually respected for his discourse, his teaching. His name was Diogenes the Cynic. And Alexander, you know, Alexander of Macedon, when he goes around conquering all that areas, he's a big admirer of, you know, Alexander's dad, Philip, was taught by Aristotle. So this family was not a stranger to all this philosophizing. So Alexander, big admirer of Diogenes. And as he's out there conquering the world, he says, hey, Alexander, that's Diogenes. And Diogenes is sunning himself by the side of the highway. And Alexander comes up with him and says, wow, Diogenes, you know, I think you're great. You know, it's an honor to meet you. Is there anything I can do for you? And Diogenes said, yeah, there's one thing. Can you stand over there? You're blocking the sun. So this is the beggar. This is the beggar. But this is, again, a subtle thing, you know? So this is just the way he did things. Now, there's another sort of instance of this. I don't want to take up too much time. How much time should we go to?
We end at 3:40.
Oh, 3:40. I'll talk a little more if that's all right. You guys look happy enough. I hope you out there online are happy enough. There's many instances like this that I could refer to, but I won't necessarily read anything. This one then is from the Wealth of Nations, and this comes home to us as Americans because it's actually about what to do about the American colonies. This came out in March of 1776 with the colonies in open revolt, and the British leaders, magistrates, opinion leaders, and so on were like, what do we do? What do we do? This is a very big issue, very interesting matter. And he actually he weighs in on that here. And this is what he does. He treats it at considerable length. And he makes no bones about the fact that he basically thinks it would be a good thing for Britain to give up its colonies. Let them go. He does. And he was right. Okay, in my view. Now he says that he kind of makes a case for that in a quite general way. He doesn't even mean just the American colonies. He also means India, I think. He wants to wind down the East India Company, close it up. But then he goes on and he says, of course, not too many people have that opinion, and it's probably not going to get anywhere. So what do we do as a second best thing? And he said, I have an idea, let's do this. And what he said was, let's do with America what England did with Scotland in 1707, which is form a union. And this would mean, see, what happened in the union between Scotland and England is that, you know, there had been a Scottish parliament in Edinburgh. You were just in Edinburgh. And in 1707, they closed that parliament down. And Scotland then sent its parliamentarians down to Westminster. And they formed a union, okay? So that the parliament was now the whole country with representatives from the periphery, Scotland, the outskirts, Scotland. And Smith said, that worked out really well. Let's do that with the Americans. You know, they can then send their representatives from Virginia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania over to, and he went on about this, and he kind of acted like this could work. And he acted like it would be a good idea, and that it's got a shot. It's better than fighting this stupid war, which people seem intent on, and which, of course, the British did, and which, of course, was to no point from the British point of view, as it turned out. So that was what he was proposing, but I am quite convinced that he proposed that not because he really thought it was at all feasible. He knew it wasn't feasible. It's one thing to have parliamentarians come down from Scotland. To have parliamentarians going across the ocean in that day is utterly preposterous. I mean, it'd be preposterous in this day, but it was really preposterous in that day. And that was a big point about the whole trouble with the colonies, was the sheer distance. And everybody knew it. So what he did when he argued for this union idea, this kind of second best proposal, he made arguments for it. But all those arguments, when you stop and think about it, work also for let him go. You see, so he makes all these arguments which really are about, come on, folks, let's just let him go. But he puts it under this cover of this preposterous union idea. That's what I think he's doing. And there's a lot of reasons why I think, you know, that's really what he's up to. Let me also add that after he makes this whole argument, he says, and by the way, if we do the union, we can look ahead, and, you know, eventually this new larger kingdom, empire, its seat of government, which is now in Westminster, it ought to be where the most people are and the most GDP is. And he said, by our understanding, North America, the Americans, should surpass Britain about 100 years from now. And he was right about that. He nailed that, actually. He absolutely nailed that, according to the economic historians. And he said, at that time, we can look forward to the seat of government moving to North America. So now, the Brits can enjoy the ocean air on the sea voyages. Now England will be on the periphery. And the parliament will meet, say, in Philadelphia. That's what he's saying. And it's like turning the tables on these guys and saying, think about it, guys. This is what you're asking of the Americans, who are going to dwarf us well, not dwarf us, but equal us in 100 years and dwarf us subsequently, which is exactly what happened. So he's turning the tables almost ironically, you see. That's the kind of stuff that he does. It's really fun. Now, I just want to come back and say some stuff about the ideological controversy, or maybe I should say conversation. So here are some reasons. Here are some broad reasons or ways in which I would say the left Smithians are getting Adam Smith wrong, at least in claiming him for the left as opposed to the non-left, the classical liberals, as I would prefer to say. That's what I think of myself as. They point out and make a big deal, that is to say the left Smithians, that, well, Smith understood that what was of paramount importance was the good of the whole of society. And it's true, he did. Does that make you on the left? No, that's not distinctive. It's like everybody in this whole conversation about the human condition and ethics believes in the paramountcy of the good of humankind, okay? That's never really been an issue. So they make these points, they point out these true things about Smith, and then act like we free marketeers don't share those ideas when we do, okay? So just like the good of the whole. And if you believe in the good of the whole, that means that sometimes the good of the whole can trump following this principle of liberty, of the government keeping its nose out of people's affairs, of the government not restricting people or taxing people more or whatever. And that's right. The good of the whole can trump that principle. Smith made those exceptions. But again, that's not ever claimed otherwise. We all know that, and we all believe that. So that again doesn't mark Smith as on the left. He cares about the least well-off, especially Smith. Again, that is not distinctive. They act like no one else does, that is to say the left folks, but it's just, that doesn't make it true. Smith, of course, understood that moral conditions are prerequisites to a functioning economy and society, that there are moral preconditions. It's true, but it doesn't make him on the left. And things like that. So that's one way that they make their case, I think, very unconvincingly. Another thing I would criticize them on is that they neglect this big emphasis he puts on liberty in the classical liberal sense of individual liberty, or as Smith put it, allowing every man to pursue his own interest his own way upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. They kind of downplay all of this emphasis he gives it. They do not recognize what an important spine this is to his whole body of work, and what that implies about his politics and what his politics would mean for today, because I don't think that's changed. I mean, human nature hasn't changed. The basic arguments for liberty have not changed. The basic arguments against governmentalizing social affairs, I don't think have fundamentally changed. So they just don't do justice to all of this stuff that goes against their reading. And then there's a whole number of specific textual tidbits in these works that they treat in ways which I find sometimes quite unsatisfactory and misleading. And I could talk about details of that, but it's okay. I won't trouble you with it. So that's sort of what's going on in this conversation, from my point of view, because I am just giving you a point of view about who gets to claim Adam Smith. I think it's great, again, that this conversation is happening. I think it's great that they want to claim Adam Smith. So that's one interesting large conversation going on about Smith. Another one I'll just mention, but I think I won't go into just because I feel like I ought to open it up. And that's about the nature of the impartial spectator, which is a very important concept in this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and about the nature and different meanings of the expression, the impartial spectator, and what those different meanings might be and how high they go, as it were. I can say more about that if someone asks, but at this point, I think I'll just leave it open for questions. So.
Do we have any questions?